Okay, so we've got this World War II, we've got the ramp up of our military production and standing military, and then we're going to kind of hold it at this peak. The Cold War certainly played into that, where we got to be ready to destroy them so that they will know that they can't destroy us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and nuclear weapons too is something that just is a huge existential threat that's been over the planet. We unleashed that technology. Yeah.
Crazy. So what about, is this a good place to talk about the war on drugs?
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, like chronologically, and this is one of the things that has been really highlighted for me even more clearly just this year, or last year, I guess. I started reading this book called Drugs, Thugs, and Diplomats by Winifred Tate, that is kind of an anthropological look at U.S. policymaking, specifically looking at the situation in Colombia and thinking about human rights advocacy and the way that that's influenced like legislation and U.S. foreign policy, but like ways that gets a lot more kind of convoluted than one would necessarily think. Like and here again, painting ourselves as the good guys gets us into trouble, I think. So as far as like U.S. citizen actors, advocacy work is one of the things that I still do think that there's room for it and it's important somehow, but I now have kind of a more complicated view of, the ways that, it is also an exercise in contradictions and making compromises. And what does that really look like? But so I think some threads too, just to pick up, and some folks who are going to be listening to this will probably be more familiar than others with like the trends of how, U.S. drug policy came to be, and like starting in like the 70s, I think, it started becoming an issue, really like this concern about drug use. And it was basically like a U.S. domestic policy issue, and was addressed in different ways. And, so at different times in history, like with U.S. presidencies, like Nixon, I think had like doctors and physicians who were involved in advising on drug policy. And then that shifts over the next few administrations to the point where by the time we have, President Reagan coming in and then President Bush, we see this shift to having now like military advisors, and military contractors are the ones who are like considered the experts who are informing what should we do about this issue. So it's taken out of the sphere of like a public health issue into a militarized issue of we're going to approach this and control it by having militarized enforcement, trying to clamp down on consumption of drugs instead of on availability of drugs instead of like the public health side of prevention and treatment for drug users and the demand side in the United States, right? So there's that whole shift. There's the, talking again about white supremacy and everything, what's now a pretty well-known disparity in terms of like the penalty as far as the law for what is the minimum sentencing required for use of crack cocaine, which is associated with African American usage, versus powder cocaine, which is associated with white usage. So of course that's a lesser offense, not going to get you as much time as crack cocaine, even though they're just both cocaine. So these kinds of things too, that are complicated parts of this, and the way, like particularly in the early 80s, the white parents, like white suburban parents, getting all upset about the possibility of their kids getting lured into drug usage, being part of what influences this shift. Because we can't talk about like treatment being an option, because that would mean that you know, it's not the end of the world if you wind up trying drugs.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that no, we must at all costs avoid our good, upstanding white youth getting roped into this. And so we need to have a very different, harder message of like, it's terrible, don't ever go there because, you know, your first step could be the end and your doom
Mm-hmm.
and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So like that's what's going on in like the US mentality, and then politics, and of course, you know, the influences of who are the voters who are behind all of this, and Republicans and Democrats trying to figure out what does it look like as this becomes like this major concern of white parents. How do we get their vote? How do we make sure that we show that we're tough on drugs? So the idea of militarizing the issue is appealing from that standpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also, it turns out, appealing to the military at a certain point, because as we see the Cold War winding down, like, okay, so now what's going to be the justification to continue with our military industrial
Mm-hmm.
complex, right? What's going to be the reason that we need to continue to exist? Because that Cold War threat of, you know, potential annihilation by the communists was like what was justifying that for decades, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one quote that I wanted to share about this side of things too, I think is really telling, comes from Admiral William Crowe, who was the chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1989, said in an interview with the Los Angeles Times, "Certainly, I think we'll put more emphasis on the drug war. And if there are resources tied to it, why, you'll see the services compete for those, and probably vigorously. We take some pride in being accomplished bureaucrats, as well as military men. And I think it is legitimate for military men to try and perpetuate their institution." And when I read that out, I just was so taken aback, I think, to hear that kind of language of like, yep, we want to perpetuate our institution. And of course, I mean, that's the nature of institutions, is to want to perpetuate themselves, but just to say, like, we have a right to want to continue to exist as this massive force in society and the economy. And so, sure, like, because at first, really, I mean, this is 1989. Earlier in the 80s, there are also cases where you have like the leaders in the military and the armed forces testifying to Congress saying, we should not be getting involved in law enforcement. We're combat forces. Like, this is not appropriate. But, you know, as times change and the Cold War comes to an end, and, you know, we need to self-perpetuate, so sure, let's do that. And so that then kicks up the militarization of the war on drugs, and it becomes this focus on interdiction efforts and sending military forces to producer countries, supply countries of drugs, particularly in South America, in the Andes, to try and intervene, try and destroy the crops that are being used to create drugs, and the supply chain of transportation to get them to the United States, even though, I mean, all of this is shown to be kind of ineffective, looking at this like still just always from the US perspective, right? Like, it doesn't actually work at solving the issue. It does not significantly reduce availability of drugs, and we just have this ongoing supply, because I think that's what happens. If you have this black market, you can hike up the prices as much as you want, as long as the demand is there, right? So the drug traffickers are happy to have this kind of resistance to a certain extent, because it just makes their product more profitable once they get it to market.
It's a little bit of a Mobius strip I'm hearing of, like, we as a nation make this assumption that the way to change something is to fight it. So we declare war on drugs, and it becomes a war, and the fighting, the interdiction efforts, the efforts to change things become more militarized, and the response becomes more militarized or violent. So we become more violent in answer. And there's it's all from this foundational piece around fighting something as the answer, and those white supremacy pieces of the mandatory minimums, of protecting the white folks at the expense of the other. And also this white supremacy ideal that I'm hearing in there about, like, that is deeply tied to capitalism, about that constant progress is what is good. And so when you talked about that quote from the Joint Chiefs of Staff chairman, that like the different services should definitely compete for these budget dollars because they need to stay stable and even grow, versus allowing for the idea of some contraction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You got to maintain growth as though non-living things should grow. You know, that's one of those little bits of, like, just the way our language can influence our assumptions of what is good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think one of the things that stood out to me in this whole idea, like we talked about, like the way our fears shape this assumption of wanting to then have a militarized response and everything. And I think that plays a part in so many ways, like in thinking about the war on drugs, particularly. Like we have the fears of the suburban parents shaping the policy decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of posture that the politicians want to take as far as the approach that, you know, they're going to push for in Congress and from the presidency.
Mm-hmm.
And the ways that just gets so illogical too. Like we like to think that we make policy based on facts and figures and reality, but the war on drugs is just so contrary to that. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously the discrepancy in sentencing for crack versus powder cocaine is an example of, like, that just doesn't make any sense
Mm-hmm.
logically, that one is more dangerous or worse than the other. That's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as, like, the effectiveness of this whole militarized strategy, during the Clinton administration, they did a study of, like, you know, what is the effectiveness of this kind of militarized war on drugs, and found it to be quite ineffective. And so I think it was 1993, if I'm remembering correctly, slashed the budget more than in half for that, like, this defense spending on the war on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And that got major pushback then, because the Republicans said, oh, you Democrats are soft on drugs. And of course, you know, we can't have that. So then the Democrats are suddenly struggling to find a way to not just do what the Republicans are telling them to do, but still make it look like they're, you know, tough on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where, you know, looking at it from the Colombian side, it's particularly lamentable. I mean, not that the Colombian National Police are a great paragon of upright practice and everything, but, like, at the same time, it was becoming pretty well known in the US, like, government security circles and State Department and everything, that the Colombian military was ineffective in its work, had a lot of corruption, had a lot of involvement in human rights abuses, and yet, like, the Democrats need to fall in line with being tough on drugs, but be different from the Republicans. And so they say, nope, now we're going to support the Colombian military instead of the Colombian police. So this massive, like, U.S. defense spending and aid money going to Colombia starts shifting instead of to the police to the military, even though, I mean, Colombia's police is also a pretty militarized group and all part of, like, the national defense forces and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But they are, like, different institutions and have different histories and issues. So, you know, like, great, partisan politics leads to giving more funding and militarized equipment to a notoriously corrupt and a group with a bad human rights record and everything. Like, hooray, like, we're doing good in the world. Yeah, it gets pretty messy. So we see, like, this shift then too, and I could go on and on uh, about like the impacts within Colombia as far as like the war on drugs and how, you know, how much damage has been done to communities through the influx of weapons and militarization of the attempt to take on the narco guerrillas, because, you know, Colombia has been dealing with the issue of having insurrection forces since the time of the Cold War too, with different kinds of communist aspirations and wanting to overcome like the disparities economically in society in Colombia, but chose to take up arms to do that and trying to get some major political shifts. And then like it's politically expedient to kind of make them the bad guys of this issue of the drug war, even though they weren't really particularly responsible or primary actors in that. Not to say that they're totally innocent or didn't benefit at all from profits of drug trafficking, but they're not the main actors. But like to label them that way then makes it so that quibbling about, is Colombia involved in a counterinsurgency or is it involved in counter-narcotics, like those can be conflated if it's the same, if the insurgents are the ones doing the drug trafficking. So as long as we label them that way, then we can justify sending all of this money and equipment to the Colombian government to do this war on the insurgents because they're narco guerrillas. So like all of the damage that's been done in Colombia because of that influx of militarization and the way that that kind of propaganda war of labeling them that way has done a whole lot of damage that we can see rippling today, and like the attempt to live into the peace process. And you know, the FARC laid down their weapons, but we're not really allowed to fully participate because of this strong opposition within Colombia. But part of that comes from that same kind of propaganda train that's been at work, you know, at this point for a couple of decades, of telling people, no, they don't really have any ideological principles. They're just armed drug traffickers. So we shouldn't make any room for them in society. There too, like the idea of othering and deciding whose violence is good violence, and all of these issues. Plus, just to mention the one other thing, I'm jumping all over the place, I'm sorry. Like the fact that we also have this idea of like forced eradication then, thinking about, so we're doing interdiction, we're trying to stop the drugs from flowing, but we're also trying to stop the drugs from being produced. And so this is a big part of like the way that US aid to Colombia has gone in terms of like aid of giving glyphosate, like Roundup chemicals to be sprayed over huge communities. And when I first got involved in Colombia back in 2006, like we were working really hard to educate members of Congress about like, this is not effective. This is not doing the work of reducing the coca crop supply, and it is doing harm and poisoning communities and water sources and causes cancer, and maybe this isn't the right way to be tough on drugs. Like, let's stop this. So we finally stopped pushing for aerial fumigation, but now we're back to pushing for that again, as far as US foreign policy, as the Trump administration has wanted to, again, kind of push that militarized response and the idea of needing to be tough on drugs and still, you know, tying it in and somehow blaming the FARC guerrillas for the increase, you know, that gets complicated. We can talk about why they justify things that way, but like keeping coming back to justifying these harsh militarized actions that don't actually accomplish the goal, but it feels like we're doing something, I guess, is part of the issue, right? It feels like we're somehow active and involved in this. So like we can't do nothing. And if all we know how to do is violence, then we're just going to do violence. Because otherwise we'd just be sitting around twiddling our thumbs. And
right. And that um, the weed killer isn't being dropped on my house.
Exactly.
It's someone else's house, and
Mm-hmm.
someone far away who my white supremacy says they may not even really be fully human.
Mm-hmm. And or even if they're human, but they're bad humans because they're choosing to make their living
Grow
by
drugs. Yeah.
participating in this, even though, you know, I'd rather not think about the fact that, you know, they live in some remote place where, you know, the government has not built roads. So for them to get any other kind of product to market and be able to, you know, keep their families fed is incredibly difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Really, there are no other crops, you know, readily available that they could feasibly, you know,
Mm-hmm.
make a living with. But, you know, we're not going to think about that issue. We're not going to
Mm-hmm.
think about the way that their government has kind of abandoned them in their areas and making them a scapegoat. It's
Yeah.
not convenient for us to think about those issues.
Yeah. It is like, I mean, you said something about like going on a tangent, but it is like a history book that says this happened, so this happened, so this happened, so this happened is not really, we're more um, like investigating a plate of spaghetti and seeing how things are tied together and connected. And oh, here's a real juicy meatball. Let's chew on that for a minute. And then something over here, you know. And so it is all connected. Um, yeah. And so now we've talked about Colombia more. You've talked about Colombia more in this like section on the war on drugs. And I'm wondering like if there are other pieces that you want to say about that, if you want to do that later, or I think I want to open the space, especially to say like, um, our like assumption from cultural narratives is of course we would talk about Colombia in conjunction with the war on drugs, and we do clearly, but maybe not for the reasons that people expect, or hopefully not the ways that people expect.
Mm, yeah, I mean, there's been since the 80s, there's been so much focus on like drug trafficking in pop culture, and you know, we've got like Miami Vice and Romancing the Stone. I mean, these are things that came out long before any of our yabs who will watch this were born, but things that have totally shaped the like conception
Mhm.
culturally. And of course, we have, you know, tons more stuff that's more contemporaneous, is like, you know, Narcos on Netflix and everything. And like, this is how we associate Colombia,
Mhm.
is with drug traffickers. And I've even had, you know, people in U.S. churches when I go visit and talk about my work and stuff. I had somebody joke to me once, like, "Oh yeah, so you must have good connections to get the like top quality cocaine, right?" I was
Oh.
like how speechless for a moment, like,
Mhm.
um, how much am I supposed to respond to this? I'm not
Right.
going to pretend to laugh at that
Mhm.
excuse for a joke. Like,
Mhm.
what? And it's just like this obvious assumption of like, oh yeah, that's clever, right? Because Colombians are drug traffickers. And that's just how that goes. Um, Not that that was, you know, the main issue going on in Colombia. Um, like Colombia has much bigger issues in addition to that, the drug trafficking issue, and you know,
Mhm.
Colombia's own internal conflict. And like I was saying, like the guerrillas have not been primarily drug traffickers. They were not the first drug traffickers in Colombia. That has not been like their main modus operandi or anything.
Mhm.
Um, so like as I said briefly, like the conflict, the armed conflict, civil war in Colombia started way before drugs were an issue. Um, Back in the 40s and 50s, really, and then the 60s when the guerrillas really get established. But this issue of inequality in society, um, you know, and if we wanted to look way back, we can see this idea of like the question of who's in charge, who is the power that is legitimate, whose interests are going to be the ones that are looked after. most zealously and defended by the state, by the powers that be. In Colombia, that's been something that's been a major source of tension, because it's the like prevailing choice, the winning answer in Colombia from the time of like the revolution for independence in Colombia, from independence from Spain. This was the question. And are the wealthy landholders, like cattle rancher types, going to be the ones who are most favored in like the structure and organization of this country and society? Or is it going to be the common people and the subsistence farmers, who are the center of things? And the wealthy landholder side won out at that point early on. And that choice, that fact, continues to have its ripple effects, over 100, 200 years later. Seeing the way that most Colombians are scraping by, whereas there continue to be massively wealthy folks. And the guerrillas came to be as an expression of just frustration and being done with that, with accepting that as the reality, basically, and choosing to do that through the use of violence, which personally I think, as a person committed to nonviolent action, like, I don't love that choice that they made. I think it's a legitimate one within the prevailing paradigm of, the ways that violence is used and justified in society. I think that they have, some legitimacy within that framework, even though I would question the whole framework. But, at this point today, it's come to this almost kind of an impasse, it would seem. So I'm not going to be hopeless and see it as an impasse. My Colombian colleagues would not encourage that, because we're finally at a place where there are some glimmers of hope, even though there are also forces trying to say, no, we must continue to have business as usual and the same people in charge and benefiting and making all the decisions. And even though, tons of senators and congressmen and former presidents have been involved in the drug trade and in the human rights abuses of paramilitary forces in Colombia, and are implicated in all kinds of shady things. And for the most part, nobody's questioned their right to participate in Colombian politics. Them and the segment of society that supports them politically insists that, allowing former guerrilla members to be part of Congress, to be part of the political process, that's absolutely unacceptable. They must only be punished. If they weren't killed, they need to be put in jail forever. And those are the only options, because they are bad, they are violent, they cannot be allowed to be part of our society. So it's kind of a crucial moment to see how things will continue to unfold here, and whether, there is legally and technically and in effect space that is being occupied by these folks currently in Colombian politics and society, but the really strong push and narrative of rejecting that and wanting to always question that, and delegitimize the political participation of those who are part of the guerrillas, and trying to push for the continuation of this narrative of, nope, they're the bad guys, we can't have any space for compromise with them, no space for dialogue, they just need to be conquered. That's still a very strong push. So which one of those narratives is going to win out remains to be seen.
Wow.
I could obviously talk about Colombia for hours, and I know you could too. Everybody doesn't necessarily know that your other hat is Colombia related.
Yeah.
coordinating the accompaniment program.
Thank you. Yeah, I work also with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and could listen to you talk about Colombia for hours. I'm just hearing so many resonances in the way that the FARC, the armed guerrilla forces that have laid down their arms as part of the peace process and tried to, committed to engaging in a nonviolent way in politics, that they've been locked into this narrative of, as you said, of like, those are the bad guys. And so we need to just eradicate them, evict them, exclude them from society. And the people and voices that prioritizes, and in the ways that, that there is some sense of like, oh, these choices were made long ago to relate in this way or to behave in this way, and therefore what do we do now? Which maybe is an open question.
Yeah, absolutely. But like, I just feel like bringing up again, talking about how, we are never the violent ones. We are not the bad guys.
Mm-hmm.
But like looking at Colombia's kind of context, I think, that voice of who is we, historically, like those who have been this hard line of, fight the guerrillas and the insurrectionists and defend the interests of the good law-abiding wealthy folks and those who support that status quo. Like that's kind of the us side of society here. But just like the way that it's so clearly not true that this is an innocent side. Like, so Colombia's peace accords were signed a little over 4 years ago. We had the anniversary at the end of November.
Wow.
And over the course of those 4 years, so after virtually all of the FARC members laid down arms and went to particular camps to be, through their process of disarmament and monitored by the UN and everything. Like, since that time, 250 of those people who laid down arms have been killed. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 community leaders, not people who were involved in any of Colombia's armed groups, but folks who have been advocating for land rights and human rights, and just better prospects for average Colombian communities. Around 1,000 of those leaders have been killed too. And the government's really mostly just paid lip service to saying this is terrible, we need to investigate, we need to stop this, and yet it continues. So something is clearly not working as far as this logic of the good guys are in charge and that's how it needs to be.
It feels like the more that we talk, the more I'm thinking, oh, really at the core of this is just fighting is easier. Fighting something is easier. That, some piece of the Colombian powers that be that you talk about, it's easier and achieves some kind of end that they want to continue fighting the FARC instead of trying to integrate them or achieve peace. And that when we think about going back a little bit to the US side of the war on drugs, that if we say, okay, the presenting issue is increasing use of illegal drugs, that instead of trying to see it as people have underlying reasons why they're using drugs, hardships in life, people are addicted, and that is actually a medical issue. Let's talk about it as an import-export issue or an economic issue. We just say, okay, we need to fight it. We need to declare war.
Yeah, I think the issue of power that's behind it all too, like what our idea of what it means to be in control, what it means to be safe, is predicated on maintaining this idea that we are invincible. We will not allow people to do what we say that they shouldn't do. And so having this violent means of trying to attack the problem instead of making space for, maybe it's not a problem in the same way, in the way that we think it is. Maybe the solution could be something totally different. And maybe this is not a Hollywood blockbuster where the good guys are gonna win and then, the credits roll. And so obviously that just means everything's good forever. Maybe a little more complicated than that, and I think looking at like just the ways that we've been moving, just look at in our recent history, from the US perspective, the last 100 years of how we've gotten ourselves into this cycle of perpetual militarized response. And like one thing flows into the next. And so we have the war on drugs, and that, having narco guerrillas makes it a smooth transition into like the war on terror as far as like Colombia goes, because, you can be drug traffickers and terrorists and insurrectionists. And so we'll just continue to attack you and use a different label and a different justification, but we can keep doing the same thing, even though it hasn't, like, what has it really been accomplishing?
Right.
Other than the perpetuation of the military industrial complex. Like, what good has it really done?